This is the story of Suriname Airways Flight 764. Suriname Airways scheduled its American DC-8 flight from Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport to Suriname on June 7, 1989. The departure of Flight 764 from Amsterdam at 11:35 p.m. anticipated its arrival in Suriname around 4:30 a.m. local time, a process that would take a few minutes. The flight was uneventful. Everything went as planned. The weather cooperated, and everyone on board had a wonderful time. But all of this was about to change. 20 minutes before arriving in Paramaribo, Suriname, the pilots received a routine weather report. The winds had calmed down, but visibility was still poor. They had only about 900 meters, 3,000 feet, of visibility. When landing at night, it was not ideal and necessitated a VOR/DME approach to the airport. For the uninitiated, that is a relatively difficult approach to a runway because you must use beacons to align yourself with it. Now, it's important to note that a DME approach has a higher margin of error than an ILS approach, which is more precise. Today, however, the pilots would land on runway 10. However, in the cockpit, tensions were rising as the captain anticipated better conditions at the airport. He inquired of his first officer, "What happened to the 6 kilometers of visibility?" The pilots then discussed the minimum or minimums for this approach. Essentially, if the weather became too bad, they'd have to abandon this approach and either A, wait around the airport until the weather improved, or B, travel to another airport nearby with better weather. The truth is, the airport at Paramaribo had an ILS approach that would have been extremely useful in this situation, but it was out of commission. Cockpit pilots peered out into the darkness to see through the fog. They could see a town in the distance. Perhaps the fog wasn't as bad as they thought. They then noticed the airport. The first officer said, "You can see the airport easily, that's right here. Visibility will not be an issue." I imagine he sounded relieved to see the airport so clearly. Perhaps this landing would not be as difficult as they had anticipated. They then decided to pass over the airport before landing. The pilots received clearance to execute the DME/VOR approach to Paramaribo at 9:48 p.m. In the darkness over Suriname, the pilots worked to intercept the right radial VOR, which would direct the massive jets to the airport. At this point, they were 9 DME from the airport, and the pilots decided to turn when they reached 7 DME. The first officer was instructing the captain on how to fly. He said, "It's a level out, about 10 degrees to the right. Level out now, and you'll be fine." However, the cockpit was confused about their airport distance. However, the airport appeared, and the first officer announced the runway was at 12 o'clock. They received a warning about a fog bank near the runway. Upon capturing a preliminary visual of the runway, they captioned the scene as the airport authorities increased the brightness of the runway lights to their maximum level. Nonetheless, they lost visibility on the runway due to fog. At this point in the cockpit, the ground proximity warning system alarms began to sound. The plane was too close to the ground. Still, the pilots remained on the approach. The first officer called 200 feet, but the plane continued to descend. The plane should not have descended so low, putting them in grave danger. NO1 tried to save the endangered plane. Subsequently, we recorded the sounds of the plane colliding with the trees, and then the silence returned. Flight 764 had crashed short of the runway in Paramaribo. Only 11 of the 187 people on board survived. As with most investigations, the investigators investigating the crash of Flight 764 relied on the flight data recorder to gain a clear picture of what happened and the final moments of the flight. That data is critical, but in this case, the FDR recorded the majority of it, particularly the altitude information, which dealt a significant blow to the investigators. TO determined what the plane was doing in its final moments. Investigators had to be creative. They used the airport's elevation as well as altitude callouts based on the plane's altitude. This proved to be a significant puzzle piece in determining what happened to Flight 764. They discovered that the plane was consistently below the proper glide slope down to the runway. They then turned their attention to the CVR, where they heard something truly shocking. Here's a quote we must use. End quote. They were discussing the ILS for the airport. If you recall correctly, the ILS was out of order. There was a notice at that point informing the pilots that the ILS was out of commission. The NOTAM essentially alerted the pilots to the ILS's lack of accuracy. Surprisingly, these pilots chose to use the faulty ILS to land the plane. They said in the cockpit, We don't legally have an ILS, but we have to use it. They knew they were doing something wrong. That's just insane. They knew their actions were illegal, but they did them anyway. As they continued with their approach, problems naturally arose. They didn't intend to use the ILS. Despite struggling to reach the glide slope, they managed to connect with the localizer, which provided them with runway alignment but no vertical guidance. But here's the thing. As all of this happened, the plane slipped further and further below the appropriate glide slope. Furthermore, the pilots were aware that they were not on the proper glide slope. They received multiple glide slope warnings, but the pilots chose to ignore them all. Why would you ignore glide slope warnings on an approach when you're using an unauthorized ILS signal to land? In this case, you should be more cautious of alarms, not less. The investigators believe that someone in the cockpit physically silenced the alarms. That's almost unthinkable. They silenced the only warning that could have saved them. They then did something incredibly stupid. I'm very sorry. There is no other way to put it. They descended below the minimum altitude. To summarize, they had bad weather, were on an unauthorized ILS approach, and received glide slope warnings every few seconds. And then they decided to descend below the minimum altitude, which they should not do unless everything was absolutely perfect. That was not the case for Flight 764. Everything was not picture perfect, and they should not have descended below the minimum altitude. Had the pilots followed the ATC's instructions, they would have been 600 feet higher. The sad part is that they did this without reason. To illustrate how bad this approach was, when the plane gave the pilots the glide slope warning, the first officer assumed they were above rather than below it. Perhaps this is why they ignored the warnings they received and silenced them. After reviewing this, the investigators investigated the pilots' backgrounds. They found a lot of stuff. The captain lacked the necessary qualifications to operate the DC-8 in this role. In summary, he was unfit for the position of captain. Here's what they discovered. When SLM recruited these pilots from an American company called ACI, or Air Crew International, SLM believed they were qualified to fly the DC-8, but SLM did not investigate their backgrounds. The pilots were required to obtain the necessary flight checks, and this captain had not received some of them. Also, while the captain had a DC-8 license, he was 66 years old when the accident occurred. Now, this was an international commercial flight, and according to regulations, anyone over the age of 60 cannot be in control of an international commercial flight. Even if he were under the age of 60, he would still be unable to fly this plane because he and the other pilots had not completed the numerous proficiency checks required to legally fly a DC-8. Digging deeper into this guy's background revealed an increasing number of red flags. For instance, despite rules prohibiting him from doing so, he once received a citation for revving up his engines to full RPM near terminal buildings in Miami. When airport officials chastised him for that little stunt, he didn't seem to mind. Another incident occurred at Belém Airport, where the plane left the runway and became stuck in mud after making a sharp turn. Then, he landed so hard at Lisbon Airport that the tires deflated and the runway sustained damage. The situation escalated to such an extent that the executives of ACI, the company from which SLM hired the captain, instituted directives to prevent the captain's assignment to SLM. Despite this, the logs showed that he continued to fly for the company. The situation worsened when a member of SLM's logistics department observed this and informed the operations department, yet they took no action. Going into this video, I expected it to be another one of those videos where a well-meaning pilot made a disastrous decision in the heat of the moment, but that is not the case. This is gross negligence and borderline criminal. Someone could say at any point along this chain, "Hey, this guy shouldn't be flying a plane. Please remove him from the flight deck." Had that been the case, Suriname Airways Flight 764 would not have crashed. It's unfortunate, but a few pilots made some poor decisions, and hundreds of people paid the price. Who do you think is to blame for this crash, though? Who made the dumb decisions? The pilots, or the people who put them on the flight deck to make them? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for viewing this episode of the mini air crash investigation.